two announcements, and then we'll back door. And then some mechanics. So the first announcement is that we're going to have in this semester 3 more classes. So the final official class will be, what, the 13th of December? Something like that? Whatever that Wednesday is, 12th and 13th. I will be here on the 20th or 21st, whatever that is. That will not be an official class. What I'll be here to do is simply to answer questions and have a discussion. Since there has not been enough of that going on, and I just thought just to leave a whole slot open for that seemed like the right thing to do. And I know some people want to travel, and I just wanted to arrange both things. So 3 more classes. So we'll start reason. We'll get into observing reason, but won't get very far. Second announcement, of course, tomorrow and Friday is our AREND conference. You may not know the names of the presenters, since what we decided to do is to choose the people who I think will be making the agenda about AREND for the next 25 years. That is, I think these are, thinking of Andreas across the hall, just about the 5 best young people working in this area. They're all tremendous. Roy Tsao is working on a book. I've read several pieces by him, and every piece he writes is just fantastic. Dana Villa has already produced, I think, 2 of the best books there are on AREND, and is doing a book working on Hegel and other topics. I mean, Dana Villa is making himself, I think, one of the most interesting political philosophers in the country. Andreas Kalivas is coming out with a book on Weber, Schmidt, and Arendt on the exceptional moments in the political. And his ideas about Arendt are fascinating. Suzanne Gottlieb has written an exquisite book on Arendt and W.H. Auden. It's a beautiful, wonderful book. And I really look forward to hearing what she's going to do as well. And Kirsty McClure is, I think, we tried to hire her here in the politics department and failed. She's simply one of the best young political philosophers in the country. So I just think it's going to be it should be a terrific conference. So I encourage you all to come for as much as you can manage. Okay, announcements. Mechanicals, a couple people have asked me about essays and what I want from an essay. So just to repeat, I think what I've said before, the standard length of an essay around here is about 20 pages, double space, Times New Roman, 12 point, that kind of stuff. Hegel is really hard. So what I'm looking for is an extended bit of commentary that really shows you mastered a stretch of the text we've been looking at. I mean, if you're ever going to be able to use Hegel to do interesting things, you have to understand him first. And I'm thinking that that's what this course should be for, understanding him. Worry about doing things with him later. So a paper that gets it right, you're working on a particular section, it is advisable that you consult 2 or 3 commentaries or essays on a particular area so that you can see the different approaches and feel your way into those differences and feel what you want to say about them. So what we're looking for is very high-level, intense commentary. Nothing grander than that. You should either come see me or email me about your topic suggestions. If you have any queries, come talk to me about it. So that's the general lay of the lab. Any other questions on mechanics? Yep.
When will you get that paper in order to get a grade for this semester?
21st of December. Anything after that, I promise that you will get a grade for this semester. If you get it in by then, if you get it in later, you will get it back as I have a chair. I have a pile of things I have to read. And as you can see, there are a lot of people here. So if each of you do 20-page essays, that's about 800 pages worth of reading for me. Figure it out. Okay. Any other questions? Anyone want to be a marker? Okay, good. My account of self-consciousness. So we're going to talk about Stoicism, Skepticism, and consciousness. I consider these, for reasons I'll come to, absolutely central bits of the text. Indeed, there's a general kind of debate within the Hegel literature about whether it's the master-slave that's the central moment or the section on the unhappy consciousness. And people like Hippolyte, Jean-Paul, Stephanie Rosen, lots of commentators think that it's the unhappy consciousness. And I fall more on that side of things for reasons I will come to. This really is a crucial moment in the text. But let me get there. And let me do that by first going back to where we left off last time. My account of self-consciousness, what I hope distinguished it, argued that for Hegel, the way I read the master-slave dialectic as an account of self-consciousness, was there to demonstrate that self-consciousness for Hegel is neither merely social nor merely individual. That my fundamental claim I thought I tried to make last time was that self-consciousness is exactly the relationship between the interpersonal and the intrapersonal, between the subjective and the intersubjective. And that therefore the master-slave account, what it means to show is to show how a primitive self-relation is mediated by another. But the fact so that self-consciousness is always, as I tried to put it, itself a kind of social institution. But nonetheless, the fact that it's a primitive social institution, nonetheless, that mediation is meant to begin or presage a deeper grasp of what makes an action or a thought or indeed a life mine. So after all, I tried to suggest that we were trying to be able to see how we might say the word I. And that saying I thought required a more complicated relationship to self than we had seen so far. Well, I want to underline this thought before pressing on by supplementing what I said with some helpful claims that I found in a book I've just begun reading by Patchen Markle. It's not on your reading list, called Bound by Recognition. And Markle is actually, if I had a sixth slot in my Ren conference, it would be for Patchen Markle. His book is terrific, and I'll have a lot more to say about his ideas when we come to Antigone, where he puts a lot of his strength. But some of what he has to say about the master-slave is helpful in reminding us of some of the core theses there. Let me return to the question of death and finitude. I made much of, in the account I gave you, of how the fear of death shapes the slave's consciousness. It's the fear of death as represented by the master that leads to the repression of desire, that learning how to repress one's desires leads to the possibility of reflective evaluation of our desires. It leads to the thought of work, where work is desire held in check, desire restrained. And of course it does so because in work there is a substitution of my desire by the desire of the other, and the like, all of which are connected to this notion of the fear of death. Now, as Markle points out, the upshot here is not Heideggerian being towards death. That the relationship to death that's being staked out is of a different character. In the Heideggerian being towards death, the crucial thought, of course, is that only when I acknowledge my finitude, acknowledge that my death is certain and all that sort of stuff, can I authentically lead a life, because only the thought of my death individuates me. That only my death. So death is the condition, for Heidegger, for mindness. This is clearly not the case for Hegel. On the contrary, the heroic confrontation with mortality is what occurs in the life and death struggle. That's what both of them are doing. They are taking up the idea of their finitude, staking it, and willing to sacrifice themselves for it. So that the life and death struggle is one in which there is indeed an heroic confrontation with mortality. And it's just that which leads to the life and death struggle. But, and hence crucially, Hegel contends that that relation to death is futile. That won't get us the kind of relationship to our finitude and mortality that we require. Well, what is the response we require? Markle says that Hegel's lesson here seems to be that the idea of mortality on its own, is in fact an insufficient figure of human finitude. The thought of mortality is an insufficient figure of finitude. Of course, in Arendt, we know that's to be true. That's why she says natality. That's her thought of finitude. So, death alone, and for Hegel, indeed, natality alone, won't give us the right notion. And indeed, in Hegel's case, the problem is he thinks that that thought of death alone is precisely what leads to the sovereign ideal of aristocratic self-will, of thinking of death as the greatest threat and the only thing, is in fact what leads to the idea, the false idea of sovereignty, of independence of myself from every other. Right? somehow, if I can grasp death, then I am truly independent. And that does seem to be what, indeed, Heidegger does think, and therefore is wrong about. If that's right, then what is important about the fear of death here is less its association with mortality itself than the fact that it takes place in the midst of a confrontation with an unpredictable and threatening other. It's the problem of the other that, which is to say, my non-self-sufficiency, not my mere mortality, but my non-self-sufficiency, my availability to the other. So the occasion for the fear of death is the experience of intersubjectivity. And from this perspective, self-consciousness's fearful surrender, while indeed a confrontation with mortality, is equally a confrontation with a very specific kind of it, namely a kind of mortality that is inflected by the notion of human plurality, that we share the earth with others necessarily, and that we are in various ways dependent on them. So that the misthought that Hegel's worried about is not the thought that I'm immortal, but that I'm sovereign, that is independent of every other. And therefore it's not an accident that this section is called Independence and Dependence, because that is really what the stakes are. And we will see more of exactly that question of otherness and dependence and relationality as the stakes of our finitude throughout the chapter on spirit. That the chapter on spirit makes those stakes clear. Secondly, it follows, therefore, that the stakes of the master-slave relation is not life and death, but, as I just said, independence and dependence. And working out the meaning of our absolute dependence on others, which I've been underlining from the get-go, is going to have to be the toughest work of the book, since we are also free and independent. And figuring out how those two moments connect will be much of the work of the book, and indeed we'll see the work of what we have to talk about today. Now, the slave is therefore essential here because he's the one who acknowledges his dependence. And indeed, he acknowledges dependence twice over. He acknowledges fully and exquisitely his dependence on the necessity of life for self-consciousness, that he's not free of the empirical world, that he's not free of nature, and furthermore, he is dependent on the other. And therefore, you may say in the master-slave relationship, it's the slave who disproportionately bears the weight of the thought of dependence. And it's in that thought of dependence and bearing that weight that he's bearing the thought of finitude, not in another way. Just as the master, of course, disproportionately bears the moment of independence. The master, because he is dependent on one he does not recognize, is insulated both from his dependence on the other and his dependence on nature. That's what is achieved by having a slave. So, thirdly then, and crucially, the master-slave relation does not any longer operate on the basis of a face-to-face relationship. If it did, it would be nothing but a prolongation of the original struggle for life and death. So what changes, what makes the relation different from the struggle, is the mediation of the thing, of nature. And that the master and slave stand in different relationships to nature, and therefore the thing, is what mediates their relationship equally to one another. So their relationship to one another is mediated by the thing, and the thing is mediated by their relationship to one another. So it's a significantly three-part structure. Now, the lesson to be learned from this is that the question here is, the lesson to be learned is, let's ask the question, what is misrecognition? What is the basis of misrecognition? How does misrecognition work? And the point about misrecognition is the master is not fundamentally making a cognitive error that social subordination. So there's a story to be told. It's told about colonialism, about slavery, about that. Namely, whoever is the dominator doesn't recognize the humanity of the person dominated. As if there's some feature of this other person that the slave master or the colonial master just didn't notice was there. And if they were just cognitively better equipped and could see that the person talks like them, speaks like them, therefore is like them, then they would recognize them, then they'd be equal. So on this standard identity politics story about recognition and misrecognition, misrecognition is the failure of someone powerful not to notice a fact about the worth or value of the subordinate. Well, that just seems an implausible story about how domination works. Rather, these practices are themselves, these practices of domination are rooted in the failure of the powerful to acknowledge something fundamental about themselves. Specifically, their failure to acknowledge or bear the full weight of the fundamental human condition of finitude, which is their dependence on the other. So it's not they're missing something about the other, it's missing something about themselves that goes wrong. And indeed, I can tell a long story here because I'm working on the problem of torture, but thinking about the problem of torture is the torturer doesn't misrecognize the torturee as not human. It's that what the torturer wants to do is make the existence of that other nothing, to remove the other as other so that the torturer can be sovereign. So what we cannot bear about our lives is not that we're not angels and will live forever. What we cannot bear about our lives is all the levels of our dependency on others, even on others that we despise, don't like, etc., etc., etc. So it's that notion of finitude, I think, and that's why the slave master, the patriarch, the colonizer, the racist, the misogynist, they are not making a cognitive error. They are, I believe, and I think this is right, self-deceived about themselves. Or rather, attempting to sustain a belief about themselves, which is in fact unsustainable. Hence the wrath of this position. Hence recognition, when it happens, if it ever happens, is not going to happen because the slave jumps up and down and says, I'm here, look. The master knows that. That's the problem. So there are deeper, more complicated issues, and that's what I keep trying to suggest that Hegel is trying to get at. This failure about our own acknowledgement of our own finitude. Okay, and that will, of course, have lots of repercussions for one's understanding of social power, of mastery, and the like. Okay, that's the extra thoughts I wanted to get out about the master's slave. Now, of course, that said, it is equally true, and I don't want to ignore the fact that at the end of the chapter on the master-slave, there is still the fear of death, and that fear of death has something to do now with some notion of transience that cannot be written off. That will certainly be part of it. Okay. Any questions about the master-slave before I transition into further accounts of self-consciousness? Yeah, Matt.
I know a little bit here, but also in, say, your essay on the dialectic of enlightenment, talking about the master-slave dialectic, it's the idea that the slave isn't a dead-end position because the slave is going to learn something and recognize something and is going to be able to move forward, whereas the master is kind of this dead-end trajectory. In the restatement you just gave us, it sounds like, well, in theory, the master could learn something I guess I want to ask, what would it be for the master to then realize his own dependence on a slave? Would this be a learning process? Is this just impossible?
It's that we're going to... The answer is the slave's still going to have to do all the work for the master. It's just that way. And what's going to happen is getting right a better thought about the meanings of human independence and dependence until we can see certain structures as necessary and inevitable. So what we have to come to see is that certain relationships to others, right, are necessary conditions for the possibility of being a self at all. And we're way far away from that. But point one. Point two, which allows me to do part of the transition, the master, I've separated these out into classes, but now we better unite them into one self-consciousness because the moment of mastery and the moment of slavery are components of every self-consciousness. So there's all of us are going to be in the position of having to learn this, because all of us contain both moments. And Hegel makes that absolutely explicit right in the section on Stoicism when, he gets both Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius in there, right? Both the slave and the emperor. Okay, we get it, right? Everyone has the dual structure of consciousness. So master and slave, this is the segue into today's topic. Master and slave now have to be recognized as elements of every self-consciousness. And we, in fact, have an ordinary, common variety philosophical way of talking about that. Namely, transcendental and empirical consciousness. And indeed, that's what I want to say the next 3 sections are all about, on transcendental and empirical consciousness. So the separation, so the master and the slave turn out to be both forms of self-consciousness, and self-consciousness, at least up until the moment of Hegel himself, probably thereafter, too, is bound up by these 2 moments, master and slave. So we have to learn how to integrate the 2 sides of ourselves. That's why I said earlier, all of us are subject to the repudiation of our dependencies. And indeed, the more dependent we are, the more that repudiation can break out. It is not an accident that most murders are domestic. Who else would you want to kill except your lover? Why kill a stranger? I mean, it's pointless. You want to kill the other who binds you, because you really are bound. And that can become intolerable. I'm bound to that. Which is also why, again, just thinking about it in terms of why there is such viciousness in domination. What the standard cognitive accounts, not recognizing the other's humanity, don't explain. They explain viciousness as simply oversight. I treat the other as a thing because I don't recognize it as a human. That doesn't explain viciousness. That explains indifference. The viciousness of domination only comes because there are deep stakes. So the issue is going to be about divided consciousness and about us as divided consciousness. Let me start thinking about how we can transition into this. Everything takes longer than one supposes, doesn't it? It's harder than one thinks. So I suggested that Hegel's master-slave relationship is Hegel's metapsychology. That is the primitive, intersubjective constitution of self-consciousness. If that's the case, as Hegel's metapsychology, then the 3 forms of Stoicism, Skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness represent 3 fundamental attitudes or stances or modes of self-comprehension which the slave consciousness adopts in the light of its divided character. That is, remember, at the end of the chapter of Master Slave, the slave was getting some idea of its own independence from its recognizing that it makes the thing. Just so happened the thing is not its thing, it's the master's thing, but it makes it. And I'll come back to how that gets us to where we're going. So these are three fundamental attitudes or stances towards our divided consciousness, towards the fact that we are both independent and dependent. And that's what self-consciousness is, this dividedness, transcendental and empirical. Power of negation and power of unable to negate. And hence, these are three attitudes through which slave consciousness attempts to make sense of, which is to say, to try to dignify its bondage or dependence. Now, if this was a different course, we would say that these three forms can be thought of in Nietzschean terms as three forms of the ascetic ideal. And I mention that, A, because the ascetic ideal is just about equals Western self-consciousness for Nietzsche. And I want to say that these three forms represent Western self-consciousness for Hegel, and that they both have the same thought that this slave morality, same word in both of them, presents are fundamental ways in which Westerners in post-Hellenic life world have understood themselves, necessarily and unavoidably. In Hegel's case, this chapter presents a phenomenological genealogy of the ascetic ideal, which is equally, I'm now saying in Nietzschean terms, coextensive with the formation of Western subjectivity. Now you can see why lots of writers think this is the key rather than the master-slave. The master-slave sets up the structure of self-consciousness, but self-consciousness as lived by each and every Western soul post-Homer, roughly, is going to have this double character. So the history is going to be the education of the race in the enjoyment of work, and that history is equally the odyssey of the unhappy consciousness. So now, saying that, I do want to insist, therefore, that Stoicism, Skepticism, and unhappy consciousness should be thought of as not, although I'll say a little bit about the historical setting of each of the three moments. Hegel flags it wildly. Right? Stoicism is obviously late Hellenic, early Roman Stoicism. Skepticism is Sextus Empiricus. And the unhappy consciousness, the bit of it we actually get, there are actually three moments, the bit of it we actually get is medieval Christianity. Nonetheless, and therefore there's an historical progression there, nonetheless, these are three transportable forms of understanding. So that, as I'll try to convince you, that Stoicism is simply the thought that only thought is truly actual. And you may think of this as what Descartes or Galileo think about the meaning of mathematics. You may think that that's what Kant thinks is true in ethics, that my action is good if I think it's good, that is, I act in accordance with the moral law. It doesn't matter about the world. It's my relationship to the moral law. The world drops out. And indeed, all, or almost all, ethics that has any notion of duty or any transcendental conception of the good is Stoical, because it abstracts from the body, from the world, and thinks of goodness as a relation of the will to itself. Skepticism, we know, is kind of everywhere. And the unhappy consciousness is simply that the belief that my true self is located elsewhere, which we know that nearly all our fellow citizens believe, along with the fact that Elvis lives and the rapture is imminent. But Kant thinks it too in the notion of the highest good, that Marx thinks it in the notion of communism, that any time you think of a beyond as where all the problems are solved and your true self is to be found not in the here and now, but in the self you would have in this better, deserving world, then you are living a form of the unhappy consciousness. Okay, let's see if we can now figure out how we get from master-slave to Stoicism. Here's one version. I'll give you a couple of versions. Why have one transition? We can have the slave has to overcome his fear of death and his dependence on the other. He does this by vacating the thing-like character of his subjectivity. Which is to say, he does this by vacating the body itself. I have to, I'm such a consciousness, deceive myself in a certain way and cling to what is most disembodied about me, namely my capacity for thought. The authority, and this is the crux of the matter, the authority of the master is never present in consciousness, that is, in my thinking thoughts. The master can own my body, but the master cannot own me. There's a bit of me that is always going to be on the master, right? So, the master may beat me, whatever, but in my mind, I know I am free. And you read any account of living under the Soviets, that thought of the freedom of thought is everywhere. Václav Havel talks all the time that at least I could think my own thoughts. They could make my body do. That's Stoicism. I'm free to think what I want. No one can touch that bit of me. So the abstract freedom the slave's freedom of thought that becomes a kind of order giving. And the thought that we can obey our own thoughts, self-determine ourselves, come together in this notion of thought. If we realize the ultimacy of thought as our true being, then we no longer desire either. We no longer think of desire as what's connecting us to the world. That we forsake our desires. That we give them up. So think of it this way. Stoicism, like skepticism and the unhappy consciousness, are kind of defense mechanisms. That masters cannot be themselves satisfied because they are recognized by folk who they regard as unworthy of recognizing them. Because the slave possesses an inwardness, a kind of incipient subjectivity, then the slave has an interiority. That the master has no access to. So the attempt here at unifying my worldview occur here in thought alone, because the outer world is inhospitable to the exercise of my freedom. It doesn't agree with what I wish it to be. So we understand the emergence of the meaning of freedom as constituted by this dissatisfaction with the world and a retreat inward. It's not an accident that people have talked about autonomy as an inner citadel. So freedom emerges as a constitutive own idea only in the context that makes the realization of freedom inhospitable, impossible. The slave, we know, has two models of independence. On the one hand, the master, and on the other hand, the object created. Independence is reflected in the object created as a self-enclosed object that is impervious to pain. Which is why to become and in itself can feel like a ideal worth pursuing, of questing after, become indifferent to pain, to happiness, to the world. Even Socrates is always presented as this way, right? As the perfect Stoic. Doesn't notice, stands on one foot. Why do you stand on one foot? Anyway, standing on one foot, not noticing the hot, the cold, that he's awake, or is just standing there. The master is a limited model because the master is not really independent. In thinking I am free because I am not in the other. In the making of objects, there is a learning of independence. And that's because one of the things that slave learns in working on the object is the meaning of universals. That is, the forms or shapes of the ideas for which the object is created. The master can own the object, but not the concept. So thinking here means thinking the concept, the notion, the universal. Hegel will say the true and the good. So the thought, or the plan, or the idea is my essence. Thinking is my essence. So the idea here is that freedom is the freedom of the concept. And that is an indifference to the particularity of things. So the abstract thinking of the Stoic is a turning its back on individuality altogether, an inhabiting of the universal, a becoming, we might say, a transcendental consciousness without an empirical corollary. Let me press this thought another way. In his account of Stoicism, John Russell says that, or begins his chapter by saying, we are all essentially Stoics. And this is shown by the simple fact that we can say, I. The saying of I is what shows one to be a free self-consciousness. Why saying I is enough? Because in saying I claim what is essential about me. And what I say is essential about me is what is within my control. So this primitive idea of the I am I just insofar as I am in control. What is absolutely my freedom that cannot be touched. Now, the only thing of mine that I can remain free is my thinking. I can't control my body completely. Others can heave me about. I suffer pains and bruises. So I becomes the thought of the self independently of the body. So there's a famous story about Epictetus where the master was twisting his leg and Epictetus says, if you go on, if you will go on like that, you are going to break my leg. The master goes on, and there is a loud crack of the leg breaking. He says, I told you so. That's Stoicism. Now, how deep is that thought? Well, Epictetus has a the saying that I believe is equivalent to the claim of eternal return in Nietzsche, which is a purely Stoical doctrine, in my view. Epictetus says that you should not seek for things that happen. You should not seek for the things that happen to happen as you wish. That is, you should not seek to have the world go as you want it to go, because you're bound to be disappointed. You can wish and want that you will, win the lottery, but the chances are not good. You can wish and want a lot of things, but if you're not going to wish or want the world to go as you wish or want it to go, then what are you supposed to will? And Epictetus says you should wish that things happen as they do happen, and you will go along well. You should wish that things happen as they do happen. Or can you ask yourself, if this moment were to occur over and over again for an eternity, could you say yes to it? Same thing. Nietzsche's thought is nothing but the Stoical thought of, and he loved, by the way, the thought of eternal return is just the Stoical principle itself. And nothing more, I think. Bad news for Nietzscheans. Okay.
I'm not sure I'm able to ask this.
Yeah, please.
Could you elaborate a little bit in this account of Stoicism on the relationship between thought and will? It seems to me that at times in the account you just gave, the two were collapsing to one another. And thought, if I understand the account Hegel gives in these pages, is, as you said, grasping at universals. And will seems to me to be different. And there is an element in Stoicism of the self-interrogation of the will as an activity that would be hard for me to understand as the grasping of universals. Seneca asking himself at the end of the day, how have I been? What have I done? What would I do differently tomorrow? How did I treat my friend? All those kinds of things.
Right. So what Hegel thinks is the following. He thinks that the gap between the freedom of thought and the freedom of the will is actually hard to make out here. That he actually doesn't see, or the Stoic, in his view, the Stoic does not see a significant difference between the two. And the reason that the Stoic doesn't see a significant difference between the two is because of the relation of control. So the Stoic does not think of universals as independent of the movement of his thoughts. And he does not think of universals as independent of the movement of his thought because, and this is absolutely central to this, the universals are so abstract. Which is when Hegel says that the universals are merely the notion of the true and the good. So universals are not the universals of concrete kinds. It's not, thinking about redness and cupness. No. It's we might say, only categorial thoughts. The one, the true, the good. That is thought. And these thoughts allow me to then ask of anybody. So they become my thinking measure. They are equal to the self's thinking of its comportment to any possible range of objects, and they count as nil in relationship to the authority of the true and the good, which I identify myself with. So that the point is nothing determinate has a grip on me. That's what draws will and thought together. The absence of determinacy. And therefore, there's a certain model of freedom. What they share is a certain freedom from determinacy. So it's negative freedom. And negative freedom turns out to look like both the freedom of thought and the freedom of the will itself, where freedom of will is not different from the freedom of thought. It's just that...
So the point of the universal is the freedom from determinacy.
Yes.
That's why the fact to be one true good and those kinds of things.
Exactly. And that is what I can control. Therefore, that is my will. Therefore, I am free from determinacy. Therefore... So, let's just turn, let's turn briefly to the text, and then we'll have a break just to take a look at the text sentence. It's going slower than I anticipated. So, Hegel says in the opening paragraph 197 on page 120, that the moment of intrinsic being or thinghood which received its form in being fashioned is no other substance than consciousness. So that's the moment of transition. The form of the thing is consciousness. And then he can go on to say, or Hegel can go on to say, for to think does not mean to be an abstract I, but an I which has at the same time the significance of intrinsic being, having itself for object, or of relating itself to objective being in such a way that its significance is being for self of the consciousness for which it is an object. For in thinking, the object does not present itself in picture thoughts, but in notions, i.e. in distinct being in itself or intrinsic being, the consciousness, etc. So there's a distinction drawn here, and it will come back to be central in the chapter on religion, miles from here, of the distinction between conceptual thinking and picture thoughts, images. Only concepts are free. Picture thinking is no better than sensory awareness itself. And therefore he has this long jag against picture thinking. But then he will go on to say, in thinking I am free because I am not in another, but remain simply and solely in communion with myself, and the object, which is for me the essential being, is an undivided unity of my being for myself. And my activity is conceptual. So the aim, he says here, is to be free. And the aim of freedom is to repudiate all dependence. In paragraph 200, page 122, he says, yet at the same time, top of the page, this, its essence, is only an abstract essence. The freedom of self-consciousness is indifferent to natural existence, and is therefore let this equally go free. The reflection is a twofold one. Freedom in thought has only pure thought as its truth, a truth lacking the fullness of life. Hence, freedom in thought, too, is only the notion of freedom, not the living reality of freedom. So, Stoicism depends upon a radical dualism between thinking and world, and it repudiates any connection between self and world, which is why this is equally, as Russian rightly points out, the same argument you can find in Epictetus or in Sartre's existentialism and humanism. It's still that notion of radical independence, the for itself versus the in itself, freedom versus thing. Well, if I only have the notions of the true and the good to think about, and therefore my thinking is my thinking of myself, that I'm in, again, communion with myself again. So the Stoic is, as one always suspects of Nietzsche, a wild form of narcissism with no exteriority. What is it that could lead out of it? If Stoicism is this thought of radical independence, nothing touches me, I'm in communion with myself. And if even in that exquisite moment of pain, Epictetus can say, I told you so. So it's not going to be an empirical experience is not going to make the difference. Bring it on! It's nothing. How is this going to get shifted? Boredom is what Hegel says. If you have nothing to think about but yourself forever and ever, then eventually it will just, and keep saying a mantra, this is true, this is good. And eventually you'll just die of boredom. Unsettled. So what ends Stoicism for Hegel is not some interruption, but the fact that essentially nothing happens. And that's the problem, is that it lacks any determinacy. And its freeing itself from any determinacy makes it absolutely empty. So you can have the freedom of thought, but if all you have is the freedom of thought...
I always thought it meant that boredom was then determinate. Okay, I think there's kind of an interesting definition of boredom being presented, which is that boredom turns out for the Stoic to be determinate. Not that boredom is something that one arrives at like a kind of nirvana because saying true good.
Oh, no, right. No,
it turns out that there is actually something determinate, namely that one encounters this thing called boredom, which is unbearable.
Right. No, I think that is exactly Hegel's thought. Yeah. One is brought to a mood that one cannot control. Which, of course, I take it to be a direct corollary of eternal return. Right? Do you really want this moment over and over again? The problem is not that I can affirm it. It would just be tedious. Okay, speaking of tedious, let's have a break. And we will see if we can find the second. What Hegel says in the crucial passage here is the true and the good, wisdom and virtue, are general terms beyond which Stoicism cannot get, are therefore in a general way no doubt uplifting, but since they cannot in fact produce any expansion of content, they soon become tedious. So there is a presumption in Stoicism that the freedom of thought will have a content. So this question about why tedium sets in and why it should be unsatisfying is because it expects to get something from that independence of thought. That is, a content. But because its content is in fact thoughts without content, it simply gets itself. So it wants content, and it gets itself. That's the problem. So it cannot get what it wants because it doesn't get either the true, it doesn't get wisdom or virtue. Not as contentful things. Okay. Now, the crux here is Stoicism is oddly problematic because it is supposed to be a version of a dual consciousness. But the way in which it operates as a dual consciousness is to repudiate its duality. That is, it sets up a dualism between self and world and reconciles them, so-called, by denying the world as anything it might be dependent on. Hence, it is left with an emptiness and therefore a repetition. Skepticism is to Stoicism what the master is to the slave. So the idea of Stoicism, so Stoicism and Skepticism are, as it were, within this now structure of thinking about self-consciousness as belonging to each individual, right? Stoicism and Skepticism themselves rehearsal of the moments of mastery and slavery. So the emptiness of Stoicism is like the emptiness of the master. Something that goes nowhere, right, is essentially static. Skepticism, therefore, is meant to be the actuality of what Stoicism is in idea only.
The Stoic's not vicious. I mean, the master. Sorry, the master is thinking as you mentioned earlier that what the banal recognitive cognitive theories of mastery can't get over the master viciousness.
Right.
And
Stoicism is not vicious.
It's not vicious, and I wonder if under this reason, which is why it's so tedious maybe, that viciousness is in some ways as an expansion of content, that particular way of overcoming the teething of mastery. Horrible as that might sound.
It is, except it is also tedious. Which is why, torture is the model, right? So
just be vicious, in other words.
Sure, but the viciousness can only take the form, right, of the nothingness of the other. And as we know, torturers simply get bored torturing their victims, and then they kill them, and there's no satisfaction, right? So torture, right? Part of the problem of torture is that the torturer never gets the satisfaction he expects out of the experience. He has this complete sovereignty. Why is that? Well, I want to say ultimately it's because it's about sovereignty, and therefore it has an essential emptiness to it. There is no content other than the dualism. I am not, the other I am independent.
That's Stoicism. And the master has this supplement, which is viciousness.
Yeah. But I'm saying the viciousness dies down. And then comes back, of course.
Right.
Torture
it's
again.
Like a sovereign. So if it's about sovereignty, it struck me as interesting, this idea of viciousness. So that Stoicism and its relationship to the world is also sovereign, as is the master's to the state. Then, in other words, if it's all about sovereignty, then sovereignty can't give the account of viciousness, because you don't have viciousness with the Stoic, who's also sovereign. That's my question. So viciousness must be about more than sovereignty. And I'm wondering if it might be about, in some way, a response to, or the symptom of, if you like, the demand of tedium, the determinacy of tedium.
Some way of giving content to the emptiness.
Not totally satisfying when I agree, but it's got to be about more than sovereignty.
Well, it's
Otherwise, it's just Stoicism.
right, and it's certainly not that. It is. I guess I want to say it's a certain kind of relationship between Stoicism and Skepticism. It's the active negation of the other as other. Yeah, there has to be an extra. So the skepticism So what was wrong with Stoicism, Hegel says, is that it left the nothingness of the world implicit rather than making it explicit. In skepticism, he says in paragraph 202, the wholly unessential and non-independent character of this other becomes explicit for consciousness. The abstract thought becomes concrete thinking, which annihilates the being of the world in all its manifold determinateness. And the negativity of free self-consciousness comes to know itself in the many and varied forms of life as a real negativity. So, Stoicism is the idea of the freedom of consciousness, and skepticism is the work, literally the work of the freedom of self-consciousness. Which is, again, what Hegel says in the very next paragraph. It is clear that just as Stoicism corresponds to the notion of the independent consciousness which appeared as the Lord and bondsman relationship, so skepticism corresponds to its realization as a negative attitude toward otherness, to desire and work. But although desire and work were unable to effect the negation for self-consciousness, this polemical bearing towards the manifold independence of things will, on the other hand, be successful, because it turns against them as a free self-consciousness that is already complete in its own self, more specifically because it is thinking. So this is still about the freedom of thought. Still about the freedom of thought. But now it's going to demonstrate the freedom of thought by showing that each determinate thing is determinate in the light of thought, and in the light of thought only, that is, has no independent determinacy, and hence it will show for each determinate thing that it can be negated because there can be an equal and opposing thought which is just as valid, and therefore the determinateness of the thing counts as nothing. So what skepticism tries to demonstrate is that every epistemic and evaluative distinction is relative to cognition, and in showing that it's relative to cognition, it's showing that there is no independent value of any idea, which is to say, always in skepticism always begins with the nominalist critique of the universal. Always begins with the nominalist critique of the universal, which is to say that the universal is not an independently existing thing, but could be, is just the name for a determination of thought. And hence there is no ultimate truth or worth, no true or good. But to show that is to show the nothingness of the world. Now, again, ancient skepticism meant to show that nothing could push me one way or the other. That is, no set of experiences could be determined my thinking. Therefore, there was no right thing to do. Hence, the goal of ancient skepticism was ataraxia, or an attitude of indifference. Now, skepticism can only therefore reassure itself, and that's what it wants to do. It wants to reassure itself about its ultimate authority in relationship to the world through contesting the authority of any given object. That is, it must contest the givenness of the world itself. But this requires a continual return to the very object I mean to count as nothing. So skepticism begins to look very familiar to us. That is, it looks very much like self-certainty. That is, remember, self-certain consciousness would assure itself of the nothingness of the object by consuming it, but that turned out to be unsatisfying because the desire came back and it was dependent on that object for having something to consume. Well, the same with skepticism. Skepticism cannot deny the givenness of the world except by having the world be given and denying that givenness. Hence, skepticism is really a certain type of movement, a continual movement between the object and the negation of the object, and the negation of the negation of the object, and the return of the object. But yet skepticism can only work can only be a form of consciousness if these two moments are held apart and yet related to one another. So the skeptic has to separate himself into two selves in order to make the skeptical power of negative freedom his essence. So what Hegel is going to be offering us here in the middle of this account is a phenomenological deduction of the coming into existence of the relationship between transcendental and empirical consciousness. That transcendental and empirical consciousness are not merely terms of art, not merely Kant's Copernican term, but rather Hegel wants to demonstrate the coming to be of this divided consciousness as itself a structured coming to be, and he further wants to be arguing right here and now that Kant's notion of transcendental empirical consciousness is essentially skeptical. It is the structure of skepticism itself. So if he can get his argument right here, we will have, as it were, identified Kantian self-consciousness with skepticism itself. So the hunch, right, that people like Jacobi had, that Kantian theory was a form of transcendental skepticism, I know appearances only know things themselves, turns out to be literally the case. That it is actually built on or out of skepticism. It is skepticism formed as a formation of the structure of self-consciousness itself. So in a sense it's deep. I'll come back to this deduction in a moment. It's deep because skepticism is the first explicit acknowledgement of the divided character of the self. It's the explicit awareness of myself as a divided consciousness, of having, if you want to say it, a master and a slave moment within me, having a moment within me of essentially independence and dependence. So this little account of skepticism, right, is meant to be doing an awful lot of work for Hegel. Okay. Well, we know that, so let's look about how all this comes about. And I read paragraph 205 as this phenomenological deduction of transcendental and empirical. Although I'm suggesting to you that we should have seen this coming a mile away when we had master-slave as the fundamental structure of self-consciousness, and they get layered in. Now this was always what Hegel was going to be up to, right? Of trying to understand us as essentially divided consciousness. And then the question of the book will be, how do we get these two sides, these divided bits together? How can we reconcile them? So in paragraph 205, Hegel says, on the contrary, consciousness itself is the absolute dialectical unrest. So it's a movement. It's going to be a movement between transcendental and empirical. That's my claim here. Between the essential and the unessential, between the changeable and the unchangeable, looking forward. This medley of sensuous and intellectual representations whose differences coincide. So again, that's another way of thinking about the difference. It's between particular and universal, sensuous and intellectual, Plato's divided line, not now as the ontological structure of the universe, but as the structure of self-consciousness itself, who we are. And we're now set up for that, having heard the story about Stoicism. We're willing to begin to understand that duality within our own self-consciousness. Right? This medley of sensuous and intellectual representations, whose differences coincide and whose identity is equally again dissolved, for it is itself determinateness as contrasted with the non-identical. That is, I make myself determinate through the negation of the other. So my determinacy is dependent on the power of my negation. So I both am determined by that other, and I'm free of it because it's that which I negate. But it is just this process. I want to get that door. That this consciousness, instead of being self-identical, is in fact nothing but a purely causal, confused medley, the dizziness of a perpetual self-engendered disorder. So the problem here is that the moments of transcendental and empirical are not sorted out structurally, but continually come up as independent moments that have no order. And that's important because the unhappy consciousness is going to allow some structure and order in the notion of divided consciousness. It is self-aware of this, for it itself maintains and creates this restless confusion. This is the meaning of the skeptic as, and this is going to keep this in mind for when Hegel talks about Diderot, about Rameau's nephew, who's going to be a version of this creation of confusion and disorder in the midst of Enlightenment rationalism. Hence, it also admits to it its own to being a wholly contingent, single, and separate consciousness. So it has to admit, right? And this is why this is crucial. This is the advance beyond Stoicism. I have to admit I am a wholly contingent, single, separate consciousness, a consciousness which is empirical. We didn't know that's what he was heading toward. Which takes its guidance from what has no reality for it. Just as in the ideal, the Copernican turn, things have no independent reality for transcendental consciousness because they receive their determinacy from conceptual thought. That's the claim of the Copernican turn. That they are both empirical, given, and yet not determinate on their own. That's Kant's claim, that they gain their determinacy through conceptual determination. So, which takes its guidance from what has no reality for it. Notice, it takes its guidance from. Remember in the very first class, I'm sure you don't, so I'm saying remember, I said the problem with the relationship of concept to intuition in Kant was this, that the object gets its determinacy from the concept. Right? That we only have a green object when I give it the concept green. And my question was, how do I know which concept to apply? I have to be guided by the very thing I claim I determine. Unless the thing indicates to me it's green, in the green concept, hey, I'm green. There has to be some way in which intuitions are not blind. Otherwise, if they were completely blind, we wouldn't know which concepts to use. We could use any concepts, which of course is the terror underlying Kant's project, right? Which is what the third critique is about. Trying to assuage that terror that we're not just making it up, we're not just imposing our conceptual scheme, right? Which is the problem with all forms of Copernicanism, idealism. It's idealism for a reason, namely, how do we know we're just not making all this up, just cooking it up so we can say anything we want about the object? And yet, so it takes its guidance from what has no reality for it, which obeys what is for it not an essential being, which does those things and brings to realization what it knows has no truth for it. But equally, while it takes itself in this way to be a single, separate contingent, and in fact animal life, and a lost self-consciousness, it must take itself to be that, or it wouldn't have to be skeptical about it. There's nothing to be skeptical about unless I am already lost and trying to get out of that lostness. So it also, on the contrary, converts itself again into a consciousness that is universal and self-identical. A equals A, I think, the transcendental unity about perception. So that, and then he says, I'll try to pull this together, from this self-identity, or within its own self, it falls back again into the former contingency and confusion, for the same spontaneous negativity, as if we hadn't seen the Fichte and the Kant all over this notion of essential consciousness. He makes it clear this is the spontaneity of thought, it's the capacity for negation, it's its full independence from the object. From this self-identity, or within its own self, it falls back again into the former contingency and confusion, for the same spontaneous negativity has to do solely with what is single and separate and occupies itself with what is contingent. So indeed, Adam, you were right to think, right, that he's trying to think concepts without intuitions are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. But it cannot hold on to that thought. This is Kant's theory, right here. This is the thought that concepts without intuitions are empty and intuitions without concepts are blind. He has just said that. That's what we've been reading for the last 6-7 sentences. And that is skepticism, because that is not a reconciliation of the two moments, but exactly a continual moment of non-reconciliation. Hence, as if he hadn't given Kant a hard enough time already, just to dig it in, He says this consciousness is therefore the unconscious. Thoughtless rambling which passes back and forth from one extreme of self-identical self-consciousness to the other extreme of the contingent consciousness that is both bewildered and bewildering. It does not bring these two thoughts of itself together. That is the idea of transcendental and empirical as thought within the Kantian dictum of conceptual intuitions are empty, intuitions of concept are blind, is a failure to think how they're related. It's not the relating, it's the failure to think that, is Hegel's claim here. And of course, not only is it a failure to think that relation, that's a theoretical point, it's also self-defeating, which is going to be, let's call it, the phenomenological touchstone. It affirms the nullity of seeing, hearing, etc. It is itself seeing, hearing, etc. It affirms the nullity of ethical principles and lets its conduct be governed by these very principles. I take it, the thought is something like Descartes. What does Descartes say about what we ought to do? We ought to do whatever the conventions of our locale tell us to do. Because it doesn't matter, since it's all just convention anyway, right? And we have to act, we have to carry on, so we both say they're nothing, which is what Descartes says. There's no ultimate authority. They're just conventions. Every state is different. Ergo, you might as well follow the conventions of the place you're in. So they have absolute authority. So they're both nothing and everything. Its deeds and its words always belie one another. Any equally has itself the doubly contradictory consciousness of unchangeableness and sameness and of utter contingency and non-identity with itself. That's why they're not brought together. It's because what we have here is two extremes: absolute self-identity and utter contingency, and there is simply nothing that could, as it were, bring them together. And Hegel imagines this coming undone, curiously, only when one skeptic meets another skeptic. Because one skeptic meets another skeptic, it's not exactly clear, right, how the negation is going to work, since the negation has already negated your negation of its, so you just get so that it can't carry out its practice. It has to acknowledge the other. So it's another skeptic that again represents a moment of non-negatable determinacy. So the claim here, if this is right, is that the distinction between transcendental and empirical consciousness, let me say two things. First of all, one of the things that Hegel is saying here that's so important is that skepticism is conditioned. It doesn't come from nowhere. It's not a direct given of thought. It's a conditioned moment in the history of self-consciousness. It is one of the ways in which consciousness attempts to make sense of itself in terms of the world it inhabits. So skepticism is not a primitive idea, but a conditioned idea. And hence we're already beyond skepticism, right? To show the genealogy of skepticism is to already have gone beyond skepticism. It's also a trying, ironically, to say that Kant is deeper and yet worse off than he knew. Kant is deeper than he knew because the phenomenological genesis of the divided consciousness shows that it gets at a non-refractable experience of human self-understanding. That it's not just a philosophical theory, we might say. That what he's trying to give to Kantian self-understanding, we may say, is an existential pathos. Or we might even say an historical existential pathos. And that's the sense in which there is a depth to Kant, a kind of melancholic depth that Kant himself was only half aware of. Half aware of, I think. Conversely, of course, he is suggesting, again, that if he's right, Kantianism is itself necessarily, intrinsically skeptical. It is a formulation of the skeptical relationship to the world, of the problem, namely of the divided character of consciousness, our experience of ourselves as self-conscious beings being divided. So Stoicism and Skepticism, we ought to be clear about this, I said, are attitudes of self-consciousness about its relationship to the world. But of course they're not therefore just attitudes. We may say they're philosophical attitudes that attempt to make sense of our relationship to ourselves and the world in general. And it's because they're philosophical attitudes that attempt to make sense of our relationship to the world in general that they can only arise at a particular time and place, that is, become explicit at a certain moment. Even if, again, in a certain way, they're kind of always and everywhere. Questions about skepticism before I... It's all clear. This is good.
How does Hegel's critique of Kant and his accusation of Kant being a skeptic relate to
Well, he's actually saying what some people have said, namely that Kant is a sophisticated Humean. So people complain about my old dissertation director's Kant, W.H. Walsh's book on Kant, that it's too Humean. Right? And I think Walsh thought it was a matter of emphasis between Kant and Hume, not an absolute difference. So, of course, Hume is a moment in Kant, which is, so that passage I read, the confused mesly, the dizziness of perpetually self-engendered disorder, can be, a moment of Hume talking about the flow of impressions and ideas, and just kind of come and go and flow and all that. Yeah.
When we read Sextus Empiricus, a lot of what he's arguing for is that we have to overcome our desire to believe.
Right.
That we have an inclination.
Absolutely.
And so there's a kind of control of desire or that kind of control that's happening there.
Right.
Can that be understood in terms of what Hegel's doing here, or is that sort of like a...
No. It's perfect. I mean, remember, he already did that in a way with skepticism. He said skepticism, Stoicism rather. He said Stoicism must, as it were, give up on desire if it's going to succeed as thought alone. So, again, skepticism would be simply making explicit that the desire needs to be overcome. Above all, the desire to believe, if you're really going to achieve independence from the world. So they know it's necessary. Yeah.
Can you clarify sort of the necessity of skepticism's following Stoicism? Or is it that they're independent and self-sustaining ones? Or is skepticism only necessarily following after?
Yeah, I mean, he thinks Stoicism simply repudiates the connectedness between these two moments. So it says, and actually it's very explicit about it, it says, there is nature which has its own movement and laws. Nature actually within Stoicism is and thought is on the other side. And it can, so in order to claim that it is just thought, it has to claim its utter indifference beyond this of this. So it is a divided consciousness that repudiates its dividedness, is Stoicism. Stoicism is a divided consciousness that fails to recognize itself as divided. Skepticism recognizes that it is both moments. That is, you can't just say, oh, and there's nature out there. Nothing to do with me, mate. Right? So skepticism does this and then does it as a certain movement of continual overcoming, right, of its determinacy, its bodily being, etc., by showing their non-being. So it's an attempt to bring the two into relation by my independence from what is nonetheless part of me. And this stoical, skeptical attitude is absolutely everywhere in our speech, in our thinking about the world. I'm sorry I said what I said to you. I was tired. My body said it. I didn't say it. I'm sorry I did that. I was drunk. I'm sorry, I was in a bad... we can just hear the ways in which we automatically... let's be absolutely clear. My claim is this notion of our divided consciousness is not about philosophical theories. These are absolutely the deepest strands of our everyday self-understanding. It's not as if we're beyond these movements. It's simply how deep or how structured our thinking about these movements are. Right? And I want to say that, for the most part, we actually drift more towards Stoicism than any other of the forms of thought. So I think there's a necessity here. Absolutely. Skepticism is the successor form to Stoicism. So, Lord, slave. So what we are seeing in Stoicism, Skepticism, and then in the unhappy consciousness is a bringing of the master-slave relationship into each self. Structured moments of our self-relation and self-understanding. So, I think what I'll do here is just say a word about the transition and then stop. I want to try to get into the details of unhappy consciousness tonight. Given it's already 10:20. So paragraph 206. In Skepticism, Hegel says, consciousness truly experiences itself as internally contradictory. From this experience emerges a new form of consciousness which brings together the two thoughts which skepticism holds apart. So now I'm saying skepticism acknowledges that the two moments belong to it, but tries to hold them apart and tries to keep them, as it were, so, and because it keeps them apart, all it can do is bounce from one to the other. Right? So it doesn't bring them together, it simply goes back and forth. I'm conditioned, I'm unconditioned. And of course the answer is both are true. Both are true, and they have to be brought together. And hence the new form of consciousness is one which brings together the two thoughts which skepticism holds apart. Skepticism's lack of thought about itself must vanish because it is in fact one consciousness which contains within itself these two modes. So what we've been looking at in Stoicism and Skepticism, now the other consciousness, is again the story, we're back to the idea of one consciousness facing the world, trying to make sense of itself, only now the one consciousness is truly self-conscious, where what is to be self-conscious but to be involved in this structure of a divided consciousness. And we know that that structure of divided consciousness is in part derivative from, although unacknowledged here, its origin in sociality, which is here completely disappeared. Completely disappeared. This new form is therefore one which knows that it is the dual consciousness of itself, as self-liberating, unchangeable and self-identical, and as self-bewildering and self-perverting, and it is the awareness of this self-contradictory nature itself that is the genius of religion, the genius of Christianity, is that it knows its relationship is contradictory. It knows it has two fundamental thoughts about itself, and they're in direct contradiction with one another. I am a living, single, empirical, contingent, mortal being. No, I'm not. I am a soul, unchanging, self-identical, universal, etc., etc. So Christianity acknowledges the contradiction, and its genius is to say, unlike Stoicism and Skepticism, it starts from the perspective of empirical consciousness, of dependent consciousness, of being contingent, of having, why not use the word, of having always already fallen into the world, out of Eden, and now it has to figure out as a fallen, broken, empirical, damaged, pain, etc. consciousness, that it knows that this experience of itself, its mortal coil, is not the truth about itself. That it knows that somehow the truth about itself is more than this fleshy self, and it thinks of that more as its relationship to God. That God represents my true essence. He's my creator. Therefore, I partake somehow of that essence, of the unchangeable. And the trick now is, how do I bring myself in relationship to it? Christianity is nothing but a set of practices which aim at a self-overcoming of my empirical being in order that I can join up with my true self in the beyond. So I am essentially unhappy because I am separated from my true essence. That's what the fall is. And therefore, I have to manage a set of practices that can bring me back into alignment with what is already the truth about me. Exactly what those practices are, we can look at next week.
So it looks a lot like Stoicism. The difference is just the starting point.
Absolutely.
It's just that it starts small.
And you're going to see, of course, that the moments are going to look terribly familiar, right? So that the moments within Christianity, they're going to be stoical and skeptical, and related moments within Christianity, because their starting point is not with thought, but ironically with body. With body as that aspect. Hence, not an accident, right? That Christ on the cross is what distinguishes Christianity from every other religion. The suffering Christ. The mortal Christ. So we're going to have to talk about the Trinity and all that kind of stuff, but we'll do that.